When we envision the Middle Ages, we typically imagine knights in shining armor, grand castles, and noblewomen adorned in elegant, flowing gowns. Yet the truth about love, marriage, and intimate relations during this time was far from romantic. The Catholic Church exercised extraordinary power, imposing strict rules, so bizarre they might seem utterly irrational by today's standards. With calendars crammed full of forbidden dates, and the fundamental idea that pleasure was inherently sinful, medieval people lived under a control system that reached far beyond matters of faith. Here, we'll dive into 5 of the strangest and most disturbing attitudes toward intimacy during the medieval period. Trust me, once you learn about these, you'll be grateful to be alive today. Imagine planning an intimate evening with your partner, only to find that religious regulations, not personal desire, dictated whether it was allowed. Across medieval Europe, physical intimacy between married couples faced extraordinary limitations set by church officials. Sundays were automatically forbidden, considered holy days reserved exclusively for worship. What about Thursdays and Fridays? Completely off the table. These days were designated as preparation times before receiving communion, rendering physical intimacy forbidden. Additionally, entire liturgical seasons like Lent, Advent, and Pentecost imposed blanket prohibitions on marital relations. When all these restrictions were added up, married couples found themselves barred from intimacy for roughly half of every year. Think about the frustration newlyweds must have felt discovering their marriage bed followed a church-mandated timetable. Even more troubling was the teaching that breaking these rules wasn't simply frowned upon. It allegedly put your immortal soul at risk. For many people, a single misstep on a forbidden day meant a direct route to eternal damnation. This next regulation might sound utterly absurd to modern ears, but it reveals just how warped medieval logic became when filtered through religious interpretation. Obviously, bestiality was condemned by the Church as a grave and deviant sin. That's hardly shocking. What is astonishing, however, is how the severity of punishment changed depending on whether the offender was married. When an unmarried man confessed to this act, official church penitentials, manuals priests consulted when assigning punishments, generally prescribed 40 days of fasting, prayer and penance. Harsh undoubtedly, but relatively lenient considering how serious the offense was viewed. But when a married man committed the same sin, the penalties became dramatically more severe: 10 years of penance. This might include a full decade of intermittent fasting, bans on attending celebrations, social exclusion, and continuous confession. The logic behind this peculiar double standard: the Church argued that married men had a lawful outlet for their physical desires, their wives. Therefore, they deserved harsher punishment because they had chosen perversion despite having an approved alternative. Unmarried men, without wives to channel their urges, received more lenient treatment for their transgressions. In essence, marriage wasn't viewed as a loving union, but as a control mechanism. A tool for managing human impulses. This reveals something deeper: medieval sexual regulations weren't just about morality. They were about authority, control, and domination. Another bizarre prohibition was the complete ban on intimacy with pregnant women. Today, many couples view pregnancy as a time of deepening emotional intimacy, but medieval society treated it as both a spiritual and physical barrier. The rationale was simple yet profoundly misguided. Church doctrine stated that procreation was the only legitimate reason for intimacy. Once a woman became pregnant, the act was deemed sinful and unnecessary, but the prohibitions went even deeper. Church authorities also spread frightening claims that intimacy during pregnancy was dangerous. Some insisted it could cause miscarriages. Others warned it might lead to deformed babies or even demonic possession. These were lies, of course, but in an age devoid of medical knowledge, fear and superstition often ruled people's lives. As a result, husbands were instructed to keep physical distance from their wives during one of marriage's most emotionally vulnerable and significant periods. Instead of providing comfort, warmth, or closeness, these rules enforced cold separation between couples. Women often suffered in isolation, their bodies considered untouchable throughout pregnancy. When you think about it, it's tragic how these teachings robbed couples of meaningful moments of intimacy and support. Modern science has shown that pregnancy intimacy is generally safe and can even enhance emotional bonds. But for medieval people, fear and religious control replaced compassion and factual understanding. Today, Catholic priests are widely associated with celibacy. However, few people realize this wasn't always the case. During Christianity's first 1,000 years, priests could marry, raise families, and lead normal lives. Everything changed in the 12th century. At the First and Second Lateran Councils of 1123 and 1139, the Church officially banned priestly marriage. Suddenly, centuries of tradition were eliminated. What drove this change? Historians point to two main reasons. First, spiritual devotion, the belief that priests needed complete dedication to God, free from family responsibilities. The second reason was far more practical and calculated: property and wealth. With wives and children, priests could pass down their possessions and assets to heirs, reducing the Church's control over resources. By enforcing celibacy, the Church ensured that power, money, and loyalty remained firmly in its grasp. This rule was reinforced in 1215 and again at the Council of Trent in the 1500s. It became a defining feature of Catholic life, fundamentally changing the nature of the priesthood. But for many priests, it also meant living lives of loneliness and repression, cut off from basic human companionship. Some historians argue that this strict enforcement created more problems than it solved, leading to secret relationships, hidden children, and church scandals. Nevertheless, celibacy became one of medieval Christianity's most distinctive and controversial requirements. Perhaps the belief that best captures the strangeness of medieval attitudes is this: pleasure itself was considered sinful. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas taught that intimacy was only justified for procreation. If a husband engaged in intimacy with his wife purely for enjoyment, he essentially treated her like a prostitute. This wasn't fringe thinking, it was official church teaching. Even earlier in the 4th century, St. Jerome proclaimed that loving your wife too passionately made a man no better than an adulterer. For these thinkers, passion meant danger, indecency, and moral corruption, even when directed toward one's lawful spouse. This philosophy turned marriage into something cold and mechanical. Spouses were expected to live without romance, without warmth, without joy in their relationship's most intimate aspect. Love was viewed with suspicion, and desire was seen as a physical trap. For modern people, imagining relationships where passion itself was condemned seems almost unthinkable. Yet for medieval Christians, this was daily life, a worldview where even loving your spouse too much was treated as dangerous. When we think of the Middle Ages, we usually picture castles, knights, and legendary battles. But the real story of medieval life was written through rules that reached into the most private corners of people's personal lives. From strange punishments that treated married people more harshly than unmarried ones, to bans on pregnancy intimacy, to the teaching that pleasure was sinful, the Church shaped society through doctrines that seem unfathomable today. For many people, love and marriage weren't just about partnership. They were about conforming to a system that saw desire as dangerous and passion as corrupting. It's a stark reminder of institutional power when it claims authority over human life. What do you think? Which medieval rule shocked you the most? Was it the celibacy requirements for priests, the strange punishment disparities, or the idea that love itself could be sinful? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more hidden and unsettling historical stories. Because sometimes the strangest tales aren't about knights or kings, but about what happened behind closed doors.